on the issue, it could be useful. So from there, we began this work, and it's been Jonathan's passion and focus, so I'm glad to be presenting with him today. He's quickly established himself as a resource on the topic, sharing his insights to help inform the Virginia State Agency and their wildlife viewing plan, and then also recently presenting a webinar to the North American Bird Conservation Initiative and the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies to over 600 folks who work within the conservation realm. And then also we've been supporting various individuals as they look for ideas for diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives for their conservation organizations. So I'm honored to share the stage with him today, and we will be unconventionally tag team presenting this presentation. And so you basically get two speakers for the price of one for the next hour, and we hope you find our talk worthwhile. Jonathan?
Thanks so much, Ashley. Hi, I'm Jonathan Rutter. Thank you all so much for having me today. I'm really excited to contribute to what I know is an ongoing conversation about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And specifically today, I'll be talking about some social science perspectives on ethno-racial diversity in wildlife viewing and conservation. Following up on Ashley's sort of deeper intro of herself, I'd like to briefly acknowledge my own perspective coming into this. I am half Malaysian Chinese, half English. I was born in New Zealand, grew up in Ohio, and I became an American citizen, I think 8 days ago. In terms of wildlife viewing and conservation, my experience is actually fairly limited, particularly, I'm sure, in comparison to many of you. But in the course of my research, I've been engaging with the social science literature around this topic, and its perspectives from that I'd like to share with you today. So this presentation is therefore just one piece of a larger conversation, and I'd encourage everyone to continue to listen directly to the voices of people with firsthand experience in this area. So, the slide is not moving. There it is. Okay, so to start out, I'd like to talk about what was probably a catalyst for many of the conversations that are being had around this topic at the moment. And that is, of course, the experience of Christian Cooper, who's pictured here. He is a black birdwatcher who, on Memorial Day of this year, back in May, he went out birdwatching in Central Park, and he asked a white woman to leash her dog, and she responded by calling the police. And I'm sure many of you were able to see that this received a large amount of media coverage, much of it about the white privilege that was involved, about how this was an illustration of racism, and of course putting it in the context of the tragic murder of George Floyd on the exact same day. But what this incident also did is it helped people realize that even an activity as innocuous as birdwatching or as wildlife viewing cannot be divorced from issues of race and ethnicity. And that was the same sort of motivation that was behind our research that we were working on at the time. So what do we mean when we say racial diversity or underrepresentation? We're going to start by putting some numbers on that, just to give an overview for the rest of this presentation. These numbers come from the 2016 US Fish and Wildlife Service's Survey of Fishing, Hunting, and Wildlife Associated Recreation. In the blue bars, you'll see the US population of wildlife viewers. This is their ethno-racial composition in the country as a whole. And we compare it to the orange bars, which is the ethno-racial composition of the general US population. So if we look at white people, 87% of wildlife viewers are white compared to 76% of the US public. That means that white wildlife viewers are overrepresented in that community. By comparison, Hispanic, Asian, and Black wildlife viewers are all underrepresented. And this is a pattern that is fairly consistent among many different types of wildlife-associated recreation. So the same survey found that anglers are 86% white, hunters are 97% white. And when we look specifically at away from home wildlife viewers, so that's viewers who deliberately leave their home more than 1 mile to watch wildlife, that community is 95% white. So it's even more extreme than just wildlife viewers as a whole. And to summarize, we can think about this as the ethno-racial composition of the wildlife viewing community in the United States looks a little bit like this. And what that does is it perpetuates a myth or a narrative that Black, Indigenous, and people of color are not interested in wildlife viewing. So, first of all, Black, Indigenous, and people of color, a quick note on terminology. This is a term that is often, people just say people of color. In the literature, these people are generally referred to as racial minorities. Generally, what it means is that these are people who identify with at least one non-white race or ethnicity. And taking that idea that these people are not interested, I really want to challenge that narrative. And a really great way of doing that is looking at this study right here by Pearson et al. In 2018. This was based on a survey of a diverse sample of Americans, and these people were asked, how concerned are you about the environment? And of the respondents, 54% of Latino respondents were very or extremely concerned about the environment. 39% of Black respondents and 37% of Asian respondents were very or extremely concerned. And given what we just saw with the underrepresentation of these exact same groups in wildlife viewing, it might come as somewhat of a surprise that only 32% of white respondents were very or extremely concerned. Now, what I think was the really interesting result from this study is the follow-up question, which asked what people think the other groups care about the environment. And all of these groups believed that non-white people cared less about the environment, despite the fact that within the very same sample, that actually wasn't the case. So what we're seeing here is that interest is not really the issue at hand. There's something a little deeper going on, and that's kind of what we want to unpack with the rest of this presentation. So here's how we're going to do that. As Ashley said, we're going to be tag teaming. So I'll start out by talking about a few points of rationale for why is diversity important in the first place? Why are we even having this discussion? Then Ashley will take over and she'll discuss some of the social science literature behind the question of why do Black, Indigenous, and people of color participate less in outdoor recreation? And then she'll introduce research a little bit more. She's already talked a little bit about that binational survey. And I will talk about some of the results of that research, specifically around this question of, are birdwatchers of color less involved than white birdwatchers? And finally, we'll try to put a more applied spin on this to make this a bit more relevant to all of us listening today around this question of how can we diversify wildlife viewing. So getting started, let's jump straight into rationale around why is diversity important, once again, specifically in the context of wildlife viewing. And the first and probably most often cited reason is better conservation. So we know that wildlife viewers often engage in conservation behaviors. And what that means is that a more diverse viewing community will have ecological benefits. Now, a good example of this is citizen science or community science. So for example, people going and collecting crowdsourced data. Broader participation in that means a higher quantity and a wider geographic distribution of data, which in turn has conservation benefits. So that right there, wider engagement in conservation behaviors. But we also need to think about this in a little more abstract way, I think. And that is this idea of a more inclusive conservation ethic. So here's where we think about the meaning of conservation itself. And on this topic, conservation is inherently political because it requires a human judgment on what is worth conserving. And this has made conservation a historically Eurocentric endeavor, as we'll discuss a little bit later in the presentation. And that means that diversity is important because it allows for a wider portion of society to have a say in how they think the world should look. So that's pretty abstract. When it comes to more tangible reasons that diversity is important, a lot of studies talk about organizational benefits. And these go well beyond wildlife viewing and they relate to organizations including NGOs, businesses, universities, any student bodies generally. And these benefits can include increased cultural competency, more fundraising, better reputations, more collective creativity. The list goes on, but these are some of the more tangible benefits for organizations. And finally, we're going to zoom back out again and talk about something a bit more abstract, which is equitable access to wildlife. And so in this context, it helps to think about the North American model of wildlife conservation. Some of you are probably familiar with that, but basically it's centered around this idea that wildlife is a public trust. But this is only true, that only makes sense if everyone has equitable access to American wildlife and the personal benefits of wildlife viewing. So just as with conservation, this speaks to the larger issue of social justice that is at play here. Now, experiencing nature and managing nature, we can think of both of these as privileges that are enjoyed by the powerful. And from that perspective, diversity is one of the most important early steps towards redistributing that privilege towards traditionally underserved populations. So those were a few points of rationale, obviously not a comprehensive list. And now Ashley's going to go through a quick crash course in the social science literature behind why do Black, Indigenous, and people of color participate less in outdoor recreation.
Thanks, Jonathan. So much of the literature references four key hypotheses as to why Black, Indigenous, people of color participate less, especially in the context of park visitation. So that's what we're going to be talking about here. So these hypotheses are not meant to be mutually exclusive, nor are they necessarily universal, but they do help us organize some of the ethno-racial patterns that have been observed in recreation participation. So you can see they are the marginality hypothesis, the subcultural hypothesis, the assimilation hypothesis, and the discrimination hypothesis. So for the purposes of this presentation, I'm going to translate each of these hypotheses into a description of a barrier that's faced by Black, Indigenous, and people of color. All right, so let's go to the first one. So that marginality hypothesis translates into the idea of access of resources. So we can think of Black, Indigenous, and people of color as having less access to resources, and that then potentially driving less participation. So for example, historically marginalized groups are more likely than whites to list cost as a barrier to visiting parks. So then next in our list, we can translate that subcultural hypothesis into the issue of cultural expectations, or differences in values, norms, or socialization patterns. So some birders have noted that bird watching is seen as a white person's activity. So they may actually be a sort of cultural stigma against participation within groups. A great explanation for this, or a quote that speaks to it, is from an interview with a Black bird watcher in the early 2000s. And this comes from a book by Robinson on Black bird watching. The interviewee says, once a Black person admits to being a birder, they have broken with the image they're expected to maintain to belong to the Black subculture, and have instead aligned themselves with the white majority. Being unique in a group you are otherwise expected to belong to is very difficult. So this may be explaining less participation for some individuals. Then our next hypothesis here, related to assimilation, can translate in some cases to language barriers. And those can be a challenge for recreation participation of Black, Indigenous, and people of color if they speak another language, as is the case for Chinese and Spanish-speaking immigrants. And then finally, the discrimination hypothesis. That's pretty straightforward in terms of what it translates into, and can lead to groups feeling unwelcome or unsafe in the outdoors, as in the example that Jonathan started with from the incident in Central Park earlier this year. It's a strong barrier for Black recreationists. And And then finally, an additional issue is social connections. Many Black, Indigenous, and people of color lack social connections to other outdoor recreationists. And this is the only barrier on the list that's actually been studied directly in the context of bird watchers. Let me tell you a little bit more about it. So this schematic that I showed you with a circle was chosen for a specific reason as our symbol of social connection. It helps represent the important concept called the don't loop, which was described by John Robinson in his 2005 paper on Black bird watching. And the hypothesis goes like this: if you don't meet others who are engaged in a particular activity, the odds are you will not take any interest in that activity yourself. In turn, you are less likely to help engage others in that activity, and thus the cycle continues. And so the don't loop helps us understand why underrepresentation of Black, Indigenous, and people of color in bird watching can be self-perpetuating. So then, bringing all of this together, the factors that we've just reviewed have been used to explain why Black, Indigenous, and people of color are underrepresented in outdoor recreation. In other words, they serve as barriers to their participation in outdoor recreation. That doesn't mean that these barriers disappear when a non-participant becomes a participant. So think about the situation with Christian Cooper. He experienced discrimination while participating in park visitation and bird watching, despite being an expert and very experienced birder. So for the next few minutes, we're going to look more closely at the right side of the diagram and talk about participants that we were engaged in studying, so you can see a little bit more about what our work is focused on. All right, so the research question that our work focused on was if bird watchers who are Black, Indigenous, and people of color are less represented amongst bird watchers as a whole, are they also less involved in bird watching once they get involved in it or start participating in it than white bird watchers? And the work that we're going to be sharing with you today is part of a manuscript that we just recently revised and is in the second round of review with the Journal of Outdoor Recreation and Tourism. And we'd like to acknowledge that we would not have been able to do this without the help of our co-authors. You can see that we had a variety of collaborators from the US and Canada representing agencies and academic institutions. And then additionally, we are very grateful for Drew Lanham's friendly review of our manuscript. He's been a champion of Black bird watchers for many years. And you'll see that we quote him a couple of times during our presentation, and we definitely recommend that you check out his essays on the subject as well as his book on his experiences. So Jonathan's going to talk more about the results of this study in a few minutes, but I want to first provide a context about the larger research projects we thought that might be of interest to you all. So some of you may have heard of the North American Waterfowl Management Plan. It's a foundational bird conservation partnership that many other bird partnerships have been built upon, like the Partners in Flight or the North American Shorebird Conservation Plan. And it's often described as a model for collaborative international conservation, where organizations and agencies across US, Canada, and Mexico came together with a shared vision for waterfowl conservation, and they coordinate together on their work and together develop adaptive strategic approaches to conservation, both within country and then across country borders as well. So since this original North American Waterfowl Management Plan in 1986, the collaboration has continued. And recently, in 2012, a major revision was undertaken of the North American Waterfowl Management Plan. And one of the key changes to the plan at that time was thinking in terms of a three-legged stool, as it's often referred to. And the folks who were involved in this revision realized that in addition to the typical legs of the stool, there was a new third leg. So let me explain what they are. So the first is that there's abundant and resilient waterfowl populations that are necessary to support hunting and other uses without imperiling habitat. The second being the need for wetlands and related habitats sufficient to sustain waterfowl populations at desired levels while providing places to recreate and ecological services that benefit society. And then the third is the growing number of waterfowl hunters and other non-hunting conservationists who enjoy and actively support waterfowl and wetlands conservation. And together, those three legs of the stool are necessary in order for there to be effective waterfowl conservation. Now, of course, you can see that people are mentioned in both of those first two legs of the stool. Certainly, waterfowl management has been very tuned into the need to relate to hunting. But with this expansion to the new plan, the focus on people expanded. And the interest, as described in this quote here from the plan, was on expanding an engaged community of users and supporters, and that including hunters and the non-hunting public, both committed to conservation and valuing waterfowl and their habitat as essential characteristics of the North American landscape. So based on this major revision, the part of the charge was to set up a new group to call the Human Dimensions Working Group, to develop a survey to help better inform the work of the North American Waterfowl Management Plan. There's been, over the years, many studies of waterfowl hunters that have helped inform NAWAMP's work, but they were interested in expanding beyond this. You can go back one second, Jonathan. Some of you might recognize in the slide where we have the picture of all the Human Dimensions Working Group members. I don't know if you're able to reverse, Jonathan. On the left-hand side of the screen there, you see Mark Vertiska, who's an active member of this group. And I understand now he's a faculty member with you all. And he was involved in informing the survey effort that we're talking about here today. And additionally, Chris was involved more recently and has been an active part of the Human Dimensions group in the last few years. All right, so the survey effort did include both hunters and bird watchers, as I started to mention. And the hunting community, of course, focused on waterfowl hunters, following up to a 2008 study of the waterfowl community. And then there was interest in adding a study to also look at wildlife viewers and bird watchers. And then additionally, another part really focused on the public. But I'm going to talk here just about the hunter and bird watcher survey. And the reason for bringing in birdwatchers was to think about how could the NAWAMP community better engage birders and others in actions that contribute to the goals and objectives. So this study was not only conducted in the US, it was conducted in the US and Canada, and a variety of partners and funders came together in the US and in Canada in order to make the large-scale survey effort possible. The survey focused broadly on questions about three main areas. One related to habitat management, looking at what motivates people to participate in conservation programs, what sort of habitat features are desired by hunters and bird watchers as they think about their recreational activities. Then there were an array of questions tied to population management, looking at what sort of experiences in terms of characteristics of the population, birds, are desired by hunters and bird watchers, and with the goal of trying to inform what might be the social carrying capacity. And the third piece being about what we might call the people management side of things, many of them tied to recreational experiences for hunters and bird watchers, looking at what encourages them to get involved in these recreational activities and conservation, and what are the barriers and limits to that as well. The work was informed first by a series of workshops that were conducted by the U.S. Geological Survey, and they were held in 17 locations. I should say they were also conducted by University of Alberta for the Canadian ones as well that you can see occurred here. And for most of these workshop locations, there was both a hunter focus group and a bird watcher focus group. And they were conducted in order to help design a better survey, particularly related to some of the attributes of recreational experience, which we won't be talking about as much today. And then after the workshops were completed, we designed a survey. And that survey was sent out to hunters as well as birders. And for the project that we're going to be sharing here today, Jonathan and I are going to be focusing on the birdwatcher data. And that was given our interest in understanding what's going on in ethno-racial diversity in birding. And we didn't have the ability to dig into the same questions in the hunting data because we only had 7,000 respondents. So if you looked at a very small percentage of them that were ethno-racially diverse, we still had a very small sample of each type of ethno-racial group. But in the birdwatcher sample, we were able to access the eBird registration list. I was working at Cornell Lab of Ornithology at the time. And for those of you who aren't familiar, eBird is Cornell Lab of Ornithology's largest citizen science or community science project. It's actually considered the largest in the world. And birders enter their bird observations into an online or phone app, and then they record their observations. Now, in order to get access to looking at that information or to play around with the eBird portal, people enter their email address and register for eBird. So there's a very large database of people who have registered for eBird that only a fraction of participants actually participate and actively submit data to eBird. So we were able to send out this survey in the US to over 100 or about 135,000 surveys that actually had a functioning email address. And we heard back from 33,000 people, or 25% of the sample. Those of you who do any work in social science know that this is like the jackpot of social science responses to be able to have such a large data set. And then in Canada, we had 4,000 respondents. The database is just much smaller in Canada. We also did a non-response assessment looking at people who hadn't responded to the survey and had a random sample there of 16,000. So then we ended up with this large pool of participants to draw on. And I'm going to share with you some general characteristics of these participants. They were 96% white, 56% female, 69% over the age of 55. 43% of them made over $75,000 in annual income. 84% lived in an area with over 250,000 population, so a very urban group of people. 76% of them recently traveled more than 1 mile from home to birdwatch, which is often considered the recreation participation away from home metric as defined in a large-scale study by U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and others. So we were able to do some comparison with that national survey that I mentioned from Fish and Wildlife Service and others to see if our eBird sample was representative of birdwatchers. In certain places, we stood out as being right on target with that, 56% female being one of them. But in other cases, our survey data set was a little bit different, slightly older, more educated, and more avid, with more people participating in bird watching away from home. As we turn to Jonathan to talk about our specific study, he's going to come back to how the sample compared to the national survey on hunting, fishing, and other wildlife-related recreation as it compares to race and ethnicity. But suffice it to say now that with 33,000 participants, even though only 4% of them were non-white, we had enough individuals in various ethno-racial groups to pursue work in this area.
All right, thank you so much, Ashley. So to emphasize here, if we remember that non-participant to participant diagram that we looked at, because we're only looking at bird watchers here, they are entirely participants. We actually didn't look at non-participants and why they don't participate. We didn't consider that at all. We were actually looking at the involvement levels of established participants. And so how do we measure involvement levels? Well, one really good way of doing that is through a construct called recreation specialization, which is both a scale to measure levels of involvement, but it's also a description of the process of becoming more or less involved as well. And for the purposes of our research, we thought about this along 3 different dimensions, and I'll explain each one here. The affective dimension refers to commitment or how central bird watching is to your life. So we ask questions such as, how central is bird watching to your life? The cognitive dimension is more about skill and knowledge. So that's questions such as, how good are you at identifying birds by sight? How good are you at identifying them by sound? And then the behavioral dimension, which refers to avidity. So how often do you birdwatch? How many times in the past year did you birdwatch? How often do you buy equipment specifically for bird watching? And so together, these dimensions form this overall construct of recreation specialization. Now, how do we measure that? So what we did is I'll try to explain this fairly briefly. We did a confirmatory factor analysis to see if each of these dimensions was present in our respondents. They were. And then what we did is we used the survey responses to create continuous scales to measure each dimension. And after that, we did something a little unorthodox where we took the confirmatory factor analysis factor loadings and used those as weights for each dimension. And that we took those scores that were weighted and we added them up, and that gave us a summative scale, a continuous summative scale for recreation specialization overall. And so as you can see here, we ended up with a scale that ranged from roughly 0 to 30 with a mean of 17. And the way you can think about this is that on the left would be less specialized birdwatchers like me, where I don't go out to birdwatch very often. I'm completely useless at identifying birds. But then on the right, you'd have more specialized birdwatchers. So the people who go out every single day and can identify every single bird under the sun. Now, something really cool about this is that we can see that there is a wide range. And so you might think, well, if this is just eBird registrants, therefore it's only more specialized people. But actually what we found is that there is still a wide range of recreation specialization. And that's sort of what we'd expect, because it is already known that only a small minority of eBird registrants are contributing a majority of the checklist or a majority of the data. And so what that means is that we can interpret these results as being fairly representative of US birdwatchers as a whole. So we use that scale as the continuous variable, or the dependent variable, in a pretty simple regression model where we looked at how it varied by ethno-racial group. And then we made a few more complicated regression models where we controlled for things like social connections to other birdwatchers and other demographic characteristics such as age and gender and income. And in terms of how we coded it, we used almost entirely dummy variables. So a 1 or a 0. For ethno-racial group, there were 6 of them, and then there were 3 for social connection, 6 for other demographics. And so that meant our models looked something like this, where each beta value, so the coefficient, because it's a binary variable, it represents a mean difference, for example, between white birdwatchers and non-white birdwatchers, the difference between their average levels of recreation specialization. Or, for example, the mean difference between the specialization levels of birdwatchers who have a friend who birdwatches versus those who don't have a friend who birdwatches. And so that was our general approach to our methods. And what we found is that for these two, social connections and other demographics, all of the dummy variables there showed significant differences. So recreation specialization did vary by whether or not you had a friend, whether or not you had a relative. These were small differences, but they were statistically significant. In contrast, for ethno-racial group, all 6 of these dummy variables did not show significant differences. They were not significant predictors of recreation specialization. So that was very much contrary to our expectations for this study. And that motivated us to look a little bit deeper. So what we actually did is we took each individual dimension and made models for each one by itself. And for all 3 of them, then we did actually find some significant ethno-racial differences, but we want to emphasize that they were very small differences. So let me show you what I mean. If we look at the cognitive dimension by itself, here it is scaled roughly 0 to 10, mean of 6.4. We found that Asian birdwatchers reported 0.3 units lower skill levels than non-Asian birdwatchers. On the other hand, Native American birdwatchers reported slightly higher skill levels than non-Native American birdwatchers. But if we think about that 0.3 on a scale from 0 to 10, that's really small. So that right there is the difference between Asian and non-Asian birdwatchers. The green bar is the difference between Native American and non-Native American birdwatchers. These are significant differences to be sure, because of course we had a massive sample, but they're not very important differences. They're really, really small. And that's the sort of pattern we observed for all three of these dimensions, which led us to conclude that just because there were some statistically significant differences in recreation specialization in each of these dimensions, that doesn't mean those differences are practically significant. The magnitude is just too small to say that. And so what does that mean? Well, on one hand, it's quite encouraging because it shows that, yes, there may be less Black, Indigenous, and people of color participating in bird watching, but once they actually get started bird watching, there are no differences in average levels of involvement. Of course, that's not to say that there aren't differences in the experience of bird watching, but in terms of average involvement alone, there actually aren't huge differences. So that's really good, but it also makes this result all the more remarkable. And this is just very basically the ethno-racial composition of our sample. So you'll see that it's very similar to that graph I showed you at the beginning, except in this case, the blue bars represent bird watchers in our sample. And we can see that 95% of our sample was white, and then white and Native American, these two groups were the only groups where there was more representation among bird watchers than there was among the US public. By comparison, Hispanic, Asian, Black, Pacific Islander bird watchers, they were all not just underrepresented, but very underrepresented, as you can see. And so to conclude, what we found, bird watchers of color are, on average, no less specialized or no less involved than white bird watchers, but they are clearly underrepresented. So in other words, they may be very rare, but once they start participating, there doesn't seem to be a massive amount of difference in involvement. And so what that does, if we go back to this, again, non-participant to participant diagram, we were only looking at participants on the right side of the diagram. But what it shows is that the ethno-racial composition of our sample was hugely skewed towards white people, which really puts a huge focus on non-participants on this left side of the diagram. These people, you know, if they don't actually start participating in the first place, then they don't even have the chance to get more involved. So it's a focus on these people that leads us to ask questions such as, how do we dismantle barriers to initial participation in bird watching or in wildlife viewing more generally? And then from a more positive spin, how do we proactively welcome new groups into this community? And finally, how do we break Robinson's don't loop? And so these questions should help to frame this.
I think Jonathan may have frozen. Oh, there we go. Jonathan, you're back. You're good.
Can you hear me? Okay, great.
Yeah.
So hopefully, yeah, it says my internet's unstable, but hopefully you can hear me still. Stop me if you can't. So best practices, once again, as with Ashley's slides, in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen, you'll see citations. So that basically means that these best practices are generally inspired by social science literature or essays on the topic. And in particular, I think if you want more information in this area, I really recommend the book Black Faces, White Spaces by Carolyn Finney. This book is a really great way of just looking at the outdoors in general, how it is, how experiences in the outdoors are mediated by race. And a lot of the thinking in that book inspired my thinking in this section of the presentation. So the first best practice is acknowledging the history of Black, Indigenous, and people of color in the great outdoors. Now, we might all have different connections to the outdoors. Some of us might see it as an escape from city life. Some of us might see it as a place of refuge or of great beauty. But we really need to acknowledge that some of these, that some groups, their collective histories or their identities can determine what they think about the great outdoors or what it means to them. So Native Americans are perhaps the most obvious example of that. They were forcibly removed from their land and often killed. And so when you think about terms such as public trust, or all land is publicly owned, or you think of things such as we need to conserve land so it remains as it is supposed to be, all of these concepts are deeply ironic in the context of Native American removal from the land. Of course, Mount Rushmore is a perfect symbol of this because it's 4 white men representing the highest ideals of American democracy who are chiseled onto a stolen landscape. So the irony there is very, very apparent. And then African Americans, of course, are descended mostly from slaves. And these are people, the slaves are people who were brought to America, and their first introduction to the land was in order to work the land for people who owned them, which is, of course, going to have repercussions in collective memory for generations afterwards. And segregation only perpetuated that because it institutionalized the idea that there are black spaces and white spaces in the American landscape. So the picture I've included here is of the Great Dismal Swamp National Wildlife Refuge in Virginia. And this is a great place for wildlife viewing, but it's worth acknowledging that it was also a really important stop on the Underground Railroad because it was swampy, and when slaves escaped there, the slaveholders who pursued them on horseback couldn't pursue them into the swamp. And it's not just the history of connections to land, it is also the history of the environmental movement and the conservation movement. And these histories tend to be a little bit more Eurocentric. So a lot of the founding fathers of conservation, Gifford Pinchot, Theodore Roosevelt, for example, they were, there's no doubt, champions of conservation, but they also had fairly white supremacist tendencies in many ways. They often equated conservation of the land with conservation of the white race, for example. And so that's really worth acknowledging because the repercussions of that in how it built the conservation movement continue to be felt today in how different groups connect to nature and connect to the environmental movement in different ways. And to give a couple examples of how organizations are trying to start going about acknowledging such history, the Sierra Club is currently grappling with its founder, John Muir, who had certain racist tendencies, had a lot of racist writings, and a similar thing for the Audubon Society. John James Audubon held white supremacist views. And so grappling with these histories is the implications for policy and the implications for participation remain to be seen, but it is a good first step. Acknowledgement always leads into further action. Now, the second best practice here is increasing organizational representation. And for this, I want to present a couple quick statistics. Dorsita Taylor out of the University of Michigan is a great resource in this realm. Less than 16% of environmental organization staff are Black, Indigenous, or people of color. Less than 12% of leadership positions are held by Black, Indigenous, people of color. And then more generally, recruitment for these staff is reliant on informal networks. So what we're seeing there is a kind of extension of Robinson's don't loop, where if you don't have connection to insiders of these networks, you're less likely to become integrated into the networks yourself. And so to give a couple examples of how organizational representation is being encouraged in a really successful way, the Audubon Society's Fund 2 apprenticeship program is a program that looks to encourage professional development of future conservation leaders who come from underrepresented groups. Very crucially, this program is paid for, it pays a living wage, and that breaks down the cost barrier that often exists in front of some of these groups. Pictured there is Jason Ward. He is another of these celebrities in the Black bird watching community, and he's actually an alumnus of this program. And we'll talk about Black Birders Week in a second, but he was foundational to that. I also highly recommend checking out the website for the Diversity Joint Venture for Conservation Careers. because it has all sorts of resources, not only for employers who are looking to increase their representation, but also for students and other prospective applicants who are looking for internships and fellowships and careers that might be focused on people like them. Now, things do get tricky in a couple areas, and so I want to briefly go over some potential pitfalls in trying to increase organizational representation, particularly through hiring practices. When I say they get tricky, that means that people are often very well-meaning, but don't understand the potential implications of statements that they say or actions that they make. So I've included 3 quotes here that often come up in the literature, or in some cases I've actually heard them myself. I think they're fairly representative of some attitudes that exist. So the first one is, we've got a person of color on the panel, so we're good to go. And this, of course, is an example of tokenism. Now, tokenism we can think of as diversity for diversity's sake. And one of the issues with this is that it can put a massive onus on potentially 1 or 2 people of color to represent their entire group, which is just not really fair. But also tokenism is difficult to avoid, particularly when you're starting with a largely white organization. So I think the key there is about the intent. Generally, it's probably disingenuous if your intent is to just look good or to avoid criticism. Now, the second quote here is, it's not our fault that there are no good candidates of color. And this here, I think, is a good example of defensiveness. And a key here is that these people seem to be saying, we are not excluding anyone. Anyone is welcome in here. But we need to recognize that there's a difference between being not exclusive and being deliberately inclusive. And so there are actually good candidates of color out there. But the question is, what are these organizations doing to proactively seek them out and recruit them? And what are they doing internally to improve their own culture in a way that makes them appealing for these sorts of candidates? And finally, this is certainly a quote I've heard in my own life. We don't care if you're black, brown, yellow, green, or purple. And this is an example of colorblindness. And to sum this one up, if you can't see race, you can't see racism. And that's probably why we're all here today, having this conversation at all. It's because we recognize that race may be socially constructed, but that doesn't mean it's not real. That doesn't mean that there are not real world consequences to race on people's lives. Now, the third best practice is increasing media representation. And so as you can see here, often environmental media, so print media and electronic media, can tend to be white focused, particularly in its imagery. So a couple statistics on this. Here's a pretty old study, 1991's 2001 study of Outside magazine. 2% of pictures of people in this magazine included black individuals. And that included advertisements of sports players who weren't even outside in the ad. And then clearly this is still, things have improved, but still the issue exists. In a 2018 study of these 3 magazines, 98% of images depicted white individuals. So as I say, there are many signs of improvement in this area. Outside magazine has profiled black recreationists. That's Jason Ward right there in the middle, the alumnus of the Fund 2 conservation program. He has his own YouTube channel about black birdwatchers that celebrates birdwatchers of color more generally. But of course, what I want to talk about here is go back to Christian Cooper, because one of the biggest responses to his experience in Central Park with racism was something called Black Birders Week, which was a social media event that reached out to loads and loads of people online. So for example, if you look at that June 2nd point, hashtag Ask a Black Birder, there was a 2-hour Q&A that was live streamed on Facebook. That's now been viewed 236,000 times. So we're talking about a massive audience here. And beyond Black Birders Week by itself, there was all sorts of media coverage on this event, which showed people that black people are in the outdoors. They are engaging in these activities. And it's that exposure that helps to break down the don't loop in this case, where if you don't see people who look like you, you're less likely to engage yourself. And so with that, to finish off the presentation, I'd like to hand off back to Ashley to talk about building lasting relationships with communities of color.
Great. I'm going to wrap this up quickly since we want to have time for a couple of questions. Two people, twice as much talking. So the last practice is about building lasting relationships with community of color. And the reason we focus on this as opposed to saying something like doing outreach is that the emphasis is on making sure that the relationship or the time spent with an underrepresented community is really a long-term investment, and making sure that those efforts are going to be sustainable and intentional. So I'll talk about a few efforts that we have in our lab ongoing. One is some research that an undergraduate fellow conducted with our lab, Elizabeth Sang, did a web analysis of wildlife viewing organizations in Virginia. And there were 212 organizations that we identified that do something related to wildlife viewing. And we reviewed a variety of their activities. You can see here our results related to their social engagement activities. And we found that only three individual organizations, or 1% of them, were mentioning any activities or programs or priorities related to minority engagement on their websites. That doesn't mean that there isn't some degree of Black, Indigenous, and people of color engagement happening through other social engagement activities. But I think it's clear that there's a lack of intentionality and focus from these organizations. Part of this research that I just shared with you all from Elizabeth, as well as other survey and focus group efforts that we've done, has helped inform a process that the Virginia Department of Wildlife Resources has been engaged in, where they are developing a 10-year wildlife viewing plan for the state that they will guide. And that's been driven by a staff technical advisory committee as well as a stakeholder advisory committee. And they come up with a variety of goals for wildlife viewing in the state, the top one being the connecting diverse audiences to wildlife. This is a nice example of where you see intentionality and strategic thinking occurring about how this work will be done. And the top objective within there, the first objective within there, is increasing representation of underrepresented groups in wildlife viewing. The language of this is still evolving, but still wanted to share with you the draft version. And so some example strategies that they've talked about are collaborating with Virginia chapter of minorities and ag, natural resources, and related sciences. You all might have a similar student group on campus. And then also developing strategic partnerships with other groups whose missions are to connect with people of color in the outdoors. So from examples of that, Outdoor Afro is a national nonprofit that seeks to connect African Americans to outdoor recreation, nature, and conservation. So in Virginia, our nearest base for that is in Washington, D.C. Latino Outdoors is a very similar organization focused on the Hispanic and Latinx community. And then in many places, there are more localized groups like Wild Indigo Nature Explorations, which operates within Detroit and Chicago, trying to engage underrepresented youth populations. So with that, I'd like to conclude our list of best practices. We've gone through rationale, theory, research, all related to diversity and inclusion in outdoors. And we wanted to acknowledge that this can be difficult to talk about, let alone implement. But we wanted to end on a positive note, because we do believe that things are positive and things are, and certainly promising, that we're having discussions like this today. So this is a quote from Drew Lanham's book, The Home Place. He says, "The wild things and places belong to all of us. So while I can't fix the bigger problems of race in the United States, can't suggest the means by which I and others like me will feel safe, I can prescribe a solution in my own small corner, get more people of color out there, turn oddities into commonplace." With that, we are done. I don't know if we have any time for questions here, Chris. Terribly sorry about that. I'm certainly willing to take some anyways, if anyone has time to stick around for a few minutes, and then you can contact us via email as well.
Sure. If anyone wants to send me some questions via the chat, I can read them out to Ashley and Jonathan. Usually takes a couple minutes for them to start rolling in here, so.
Jonathan, if you wouldn't mind going back on the slide, a few people wanted to write down the title of Drew Lanham's book.
Oh, yeah, yep. Sorry. There it is.
He's also done some really good podcasts lately. And the This Is Love podcast was a really good one. If you like podcasts, that would be a great one to listen to. I think it's called The Prairie Warbler was the name of the episode. I highly recommend that one.
Yeah, and I'd also say if you want a 3-minute read from Drew Lanham, his probably most famous essay is called 9 Rules for the Black Birdwatcher. And that's a very short, somewhat humorous little essay online. So that's an easy place to start.
Any questions? Make sure you shoot them to me in chat.
What?
I guess I have one. Where are you guys moving with this next? What's the next step in this study or this process?
Yeah, so I can briefly add a little bit there, and then Jonathan can add his thoughts. So in Virginia, we are continuing to work with the state agency on their wildlife viewing plan. And so it's our hope that we might also have opportunities to work with them in collaboration with a new faculty member in our department, Willa Chavez, to look at the effectiveness of some of the programs that they might put into place related to trying to increase representation of various ethno-racial groups within viewing. So I hope we can go that route. There's really a dearth of information looking at the effectiveness of various programs, certainly within bird watching. So that's one realm. And then similarly, we're going to be doing a broad scale study now of wildlife viewers across the country using a national panel survey to support state fish and wildlife agencies across the whole country. We just recently found out we have Association of Fish and Wildlife Agency funding. And so we hope to be able to dig into this piece a little bit within there as well. There's certainly lots of more room for work in this realm, and I'd love to have a future graduate student, as Jonathan's going to be deserting me, who has interest in this area.
Yeah, I don't have much more to add to that. I guess in terms of the paper itself, the most important next step is getting it published. But on top of that, I'm very happy to be working right now in this research team that's working with the Department of Wildlife Resources in Virginia. And so I think it's been a really cool experience being able to apply some of what I've learned through my research to helping those stakeholder groups and technical advisory groups create their wildlife viewing plans. So in terms of the research itself, I'm not sure how much more I'll be spending on this, but I really enjoy the opportunities I have to continue to apply it.
We have a question from Tanya. Thanks for a great presentation. Was the network question limited to people you know, or also people who might be role models but not personally known? That's the social question.
So the social question asked, do you know any close friends who also birdwatch? Do you know any relatives who also birdwatch? And do you know any acquaintances who also birdwatch? So the idea there being weak ties, I guess, being acquaintances, and strong ties being close friends and relatives. The obvious limitation to that was that we only asked yes or no. We didn't ask how many. We didn't ask, we didn't make any social network or anything between different people. And we also didn't ask the ethno-racial group of the people they know. So it was only just a limited analysis. We used it to control. We did a little extra analysis on it, but that's certainly an area for future research.
It's not a question, but it's a comment from Brianne. She says, phenomenal presentation. Thank you all so much for speaking on this topic. I did have one other question too. Is the university using, your department using any of this information to move forward?
So Yeah, so our College of Natural Resources and Environment is very involved in diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts, and even more so after the events of the summer. We hired last spring, she'll be starting in January, a new diversity, equity, and inclusion director for the college, who will be a professor of practice. So not only will she be involved in activities to help improve the situation for students and recruit students, but then she's also going to be teaching courses. Our college was very excited when Jonathan presented this recently in a webinar, and we had lots of folks, including the dean, listening in on the presentation. We have within our Department of Fish and Wildlife a new DEI graduate student group, as well as a faculty committee additionally. So Jonathan and I are both involved in those places where we can directly insert our insights from our work as well.
Excellent. Well, I don't see any other questions. Thank you so much for this great presentation, and have a great day.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks so much for having us.